Hey, why? That's not a sign. All right, good evening, everybody. I'd like to call the meeting of the Committee of the Whole to order. I've got Monday, April 24th, 2023, and 7 o'clock. We will start this evening with a discussion on zoning classifications. Director Blackford, I'm assuming this is you.
Good evening, everyone, and yes, I'll have the pleasure of doing a deep dive on zoning. Again, my understanding is we want to talk about zoning classifications and uses within zoning. So I'm going to walk you through, a few different scenarios, how our code classifies uses and that. And by all means, at any time in the presentation, please stop and ask questions and comment as often as you like.
My question is, what's the number that we're to get to the,
So we can see it on the iPads. Is there a,
Number in the
Oh,
bottom
the
right
chamber,
column.
the access number, Kevin?
You shouldn't need an access number anymore.
Mine popped up.
oh, no.
there we go.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Did that just happen?
Is it? All right, I go back. Can you go?
Sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry to break your stride there, man.
Start again, Michael.
That's quite all right. Is it still working all right now that I went back to
Yeah.
full screen? All right, great. So again, zoning classifications, uses. So there's really 2 or 3 types of uses. They're either allowed by right, which means staff administratively approvable. It's a conditional use, which is not administratively approvable. It goes on to Planning Commission for approval or denial of that request. We also have a few different designations and a prohibited use section. Some zoning codes will have a big prohibited use section, some don't have any. The way zoning typically works is that if a use is not specifically spelled out as being permissible, then it's not allowed. But we do have some prohibited uses within the city. In case you're curious, we have 26 different zoning designations, which is a lot for a city of this size. 10 of those were residential, and I'll say the other 16 are commercial. That would include mixed use and industrial under those commercial categories. And from now on, I'm only going to be talking about commercial classifications. So, how are uses determined for commercial zoning? Well, our code uses 3 different ways of determining uses. It may reference the SIC code, which stands for the Standard Industrial Classification Code, or the NAICS code, which is the North American Industry Classification System code. Both of those codes are part of the federal government. The Census Bureau, has that information. Or we use plain English. It's not, it's whatever the dictionary would define that term as. And again, we have a prohibited use section that applies to all Gahanna properties regardless of what the zoning is. And if you're curious, we have 11 different, out of those 16 commercial zonings, 11 use the SIC, 4 use the NAICS code, and 1 uses plain English. All right, I'm going to run through a couple of real-world scenarios here of, is my use allowed? And this first one and the next one are specific to a specific use and piece of property. We get a lot of these kind of phone calls. This is one, believe it or not, we've had close to a dozen phone calls about truck parking in OCT. OCT zoning is Office Commerce Technology. A lot of office, that's really south of Taylor Road in the city. Almost all properties are zoned OCT. A lot of office uses, but primarily industrial warehouse uses. So truck parking, that's a parking lot. That's allowed, that's a permitted use. But we said that's a really odd question to ask. You're just going to park trucks. So what else are you going to be doing on site, if anything? And you're like, well, now that you mention it, maybe we'll also have some automotive repair. Well, an OCT automotive repair is a permitted use. Then they said, well, we might want to sell some parts. Well, it depends how you're selling parts, because if it's retail, that's a permitted use. If it's wholesale, that's actually a prohibited use, specifically called out as being prohibited within the city. Then they said, well, maybe actually we also want to have some towing with our parking lot. Well, a towing facility would be a conditional use with an OCT. And they said, well, we might leave the cars there for a long period of time. Well, you can store them there, but at some point, this would be a gray area of the code. Your long-term storage just becomes a junkyard, and junkyards are specifically prohibited in Gahanna. So that's a real-world example of how some of the conversations staff has with folks. Here's another real-world example. This is like the last one. This is a specific use on a specific piece of property. This time it's in our suburban office and institutional zoning, SO. And this was a realtor who was working on a transaction and said, hey, Gahanna zoning folks, I need a letter saying that medical office is an allowed use. Great, we can do that. However, what my definition of a medical office or what a realtor's definition of medical office might not be the same as, in this case, the SIC code. So we had to ask for additional information. What are you really talking about when you say a medical office? Well, we're taking blood and collecting specimens. Okay, that seems pretty innocuous kind of use. Lo and behold, the SIC code, in order to determine how to classify that use, if it was a doctor collecting those samples, it categorized it differently than someone else. In most places, a doctor doesn't do that. It's probably a nurse practitioner or someone. So if it was a doctor, the use was allowed by right. If it was someone else, it's a conditional use. Sometimes we have uses that could be categorized in multiple categories, so we were trying to figure out a way this use could be allowed by right. So we looked at the SIC code and said, well, if you're collecting specimens and processing them on site, then that would be an allowed use. If it was done off-site, that was a conditional use. In this case, it wasn't being done by a doctor and it was being processed off-site, so they had to file a conditional use request and go before Planning Commission to get that approval. Next few slides, I know you really can't read this. This is what our zoning code looks like for suburban office and institutional. The zoning district I was just talking about. So what I think is important here is, you know, we have these numbers, and these numbers refer to the SIC code here, and there's actually 44 different sets of numbers in this one particular zoning. And suburban office is actually a little bit more of a simpler zoning because it doesn't allow for retail types of uses or industrial. It's really just office uses. So in this case, there's 44 different numbers there associated with that, and I'll talk about a couple of those numbers and what those mean. And again, so this is just, you know, what the zoning code looks like in those numbers. So we get a lot of phone calls about, you know, what uses are allowed in my zoning. In this case, I have a piece of property, it's zoned suburban office. Tell me everything that's allowable. That's going to be very challenging, and here's why. Because again, we use the SIC code in this particular case. How they determine uses might be different than how a layperson determines uses. So I just chose 3 of those numbers at random. And again, we have 44 of those different numbers. So number 65, which is real estate. When you go into that, there's actually 10 subsections of real estate. That could be 651, 652, 6521, all those various numbers. So there's 10 unique subsections. When you look into that, there's 63 unique uses that are allowed just under that one use classification. And if I look at 801, which is office and clinics of doctors of medicine, there's 59 different uses allowed under that. Then services not elsewhere defined, there's 46 unique uses. So right there, I believe that comes up to about 168 or so different uses. That's just looking at 3 of those 44 numbers. So we get into the thousands pretty quick of what could and could not be allowed in zoning. So it's very difficult to say, you know, what's allowed in my zoning. So we also have another type of call that we get, and that's, you know, where's my use allowed? I want to open up a business in Gahanna. Where should I be looking at? This is not a real-world example. I was just curious what the code would say. So in this case, we're calling up, where would a vape shop be allowed? So first we'd have to say, how does a code define a vape shop? Well, at the end of the day, it's the retail sale of tobacco. So we have 3 different methods of determining a use. Again, the NAICS code, the SIC code, and plain English. So what I would do is I would have to search in the NAICS code and SIC code for tobacco. When I do that, I get 15 different references. Sometimes that use might be allowed in several of those different use categories. In this case, not so much. It's a little bit simpler. You know, it's a tobacco store. It's a retail sale of tobacco. So there's a specific number, as you can see there. So then staff, we would have to look at those 16 different commercial zonings to see where that number was referenced. And for plain English, it's a little bit different because whether it's shoelaces or firearms or tobacco, it's a retail sale of goods unless you have it specifically listed as prohibited. So I think you see more prohibited uses in codes that use plain English because, again, it's very broad general terms. In case you're curious, 11 of the 16 commercial districts would allow a vape shop. So you might be asking yourself, well, that's zoning code. We have a land use plan. What is the land use plan role in determining uses? Well, that depends a little bit on state laws and that. About 25% of states require a comprehensive plan. Ohio is not one of those. So that means zoning is law, zoning is king. If there was a comprehensive plan, it would be your future land use that would dictate where those uses can go. But again, that doesn't apply to Ohio. So since it doesn't mandate comprehensive plans and therefore land use plans, the land use plan is a guide and it's very high level. When it talks about uses, primarily what you're going to see in the land use plan are terms like residential, commercial, industrial. It's not going to have 58 separate uses. Typically very high level with a few exceptions. It does also make recommendations on, like the development parameters, what the setback should be, what's the density and intensity of development and that. And again, it's a guide, it's not law. Really the land use plan helps guide zoning code because it says with that future land use map where we want to see, looking out into the future, where are areas where we want to see commercial growth or higher density residential, things of that nature. So now you might be asking yourself, where are we at in the zoning code rewrite? And we talked about that briefly a month or so ago. Talked about maybe 5 or 6 different drafts at this point. So what has happened? Well, our zoning code is if you went to print it out, 399 pages. So that's pretty intense for a suburban zoning code. We're hoping to get that down to maybe half the size of what it is today. So a lot of what we've been working on is formatting and eliminating obsolete code sections. Like our code, in my opinion, having done this for 20 years, it's very heavy on process and roles and responsibilities of individuals. Like there's 91 different references in the zoning code to the planning and zoning administrator. We don't even have a planning and zoning administrator. Probably less than half the time I've been with the city, there's a planning and zoning administrator. So what good does it talk about what their role is in a conditional use when we don't have that position? So that's somewhat unique for the Gahanna code. I think that's kind of how a lot of the area codes are written. So again, we've been working on just sort of getting that down to a more manageable number. What we haven't done is we haven't really looked at our zoning districts and going from 26 to 13 or 10 or 20, whatever that is, and then identifying what uses are appropriate in what zones. And then we haven't looked at like a zoning map to say, all right, where do we want to put those zoning classifications? I guarantee you that'll be part of a workshop that will be upcoming with City Council and Planning Commission. We are looking to schedule a time here with our consultant, and we're shooting for early mid-June here, so the next 45 or 60 days. And with that, I will be more than happy to answer any questions that you all have.
Thank you, Director. Mr. Schnetzer.
Thank you for the overview, Director Blackford. My question is, what happens after the workshop in June-ish timeframe? Is there a...
Yeah, it depends. What I envision at this point is still a little preliminary, but let's say we have a workshop and we're talking about uses. We need to have a zoning code for you to react to. So we'll have zoning districts and have some uses. That's really meant to, spur some conversation and that. And so let's say we all sit together, we look at those uses, and, we want to see, fewer uses and zoning X, Y, Z. What staff and the consultant would do then is have at a follow-up workshop, what I envision there would be, okay, this is what you looked at in June. Now this is what we're looking at in July, August, whatever that would be. And here's how that changes. And then I would think it would be helpful to do a comparison to a certain degree of how that new code stacks up with the current code. And that, so we can see it just, how permissive or limiting we are in the code rewrite compared to our existing code.
I guess I'll ask the question in a different way. With regard to the zoning rewrite, presumably something needs to come back to be passed and enacted into law. Do you have like an intended time frame for that?
Yes,
Or-
sorry. Yes, that would be before the end of 2023. Right now, we're just had a call with the consultant, still looking at, very tentative, maybe an October hearing date for council. And they said that that timeline where we're at, still works for
Okay.
them. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Renner?
Thank you for that really good presentation. It was a nice overview. For a common person, where can we go to actually see the current zoning map? Is it on our website somewhere?
Oh, yeah, there's right on the planning and webpage, there's a zoning map. There's also links throughout the website because of GIS mapping, and most of our GIS maps have a zoning layer associated with that.
So I'm reacting a little bit after all the upheaval that we've had recently.
Just kidding.
Yeah, just kidding. And there's something I've been talking about a lot more this year is at-risk properties. And can we look at the zoning map and understand, is it easy, I guess what I'm saying is it easy to look at our major arteries and like Grenville Street, Hamilton, and understand what the zoning is there and what can go in today if somebody wanted to come in today?
Yes and no. I think it's easy to find that out. It's challenging to say what can and can't go when it's very broad. Just by using that example from the presentation about suburban office, with looking at just 3 of those 44 numbers, there were 150 plus different uses. So it's going to be very tough to boil that down into a couple thousand into something. But if it was a specific use or uses, it's a lot easier. I think that's definitely what's going to happen as part of the zoning code rewrite, because we'll have all new zoning classifications, terminologies changed throughout the decades, and that. So we need some updating and some streamlining there. And then that's probably the fun and most impactful part of the zoning process would be looking at how we, what our zoning categories are, what they allow, and then looking at a zoning map and saying, as a group, where are these appropriate, where are they not? And so, you can zonings don't have to allow everything everywhere. We have to be more mindful and strategic of where we locate things. We have to locate pretty much everything somewhere. It just doesn't have to be everywhere. So we can be more mindful and target, like you said, those areas where we're probably going to see more growth, and really make sure that we're encouraging the type of growth that we're looking for. And you can do that through a zoning code with uses.
Okay.
Mrs. McGregor?
I have I guess just maybe an observation. You talked about the planning and zoning administrator listed so many times, but I've been here a fair amount of time too, and the departments have changed and rearranged, and so even though that's a title that maybe nobody has right now, somebody could be designated as that title, even if they had another title. Like we could designate you as a planning and zoning administrator so that you had all the responsibilities of that in the
It's
code.
like you have a crystal ball, because that's part of the next part of the zoning code twin bill we have tonight. That's actually a change in the zoning code to have a definition of planning and zoning administrator and clarifying who does those responsibilities.
Because, well, but it might work for now, but in,
That is in today's code, yes.
okay, but in
Yeah.
4 or 5 years, they might rearrange the departments different, and then that's not the same, and so, I mean, it's just, but you could always go, even if it was an outdated title, you could always designate somebody, or the
Yep.
mayor could, somebody as that title, to go along with the current code at that time.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
That's what we have now.
And I would add that as we have been making some code changes, we've been going to more generic, instead of Director of Public Service and Engineering, just Director responsible for those tasks or as assigned by mayor. And then I have signed multiple memorandums designating people with the titles as job duties and
didn't
job
know that.
functions had changed, so yes. But good point, because trying to streamline that so that you're not constantly having to
Right.
go back and do the internal memos or doing a code change to reflect that makes sense.
That's all I
Anyone
have.
else? Okay, well, thank you very much, Director. I think you're up next. Don't go anywhere.
That applies to you all as well. All right, no presentation for this item. I will be going through here, item by item with you with just a quick summary of the various code changes. I will say that, these are code changes to our current zoning code. Don't confuse it with the zoning code rewrite. These are low-hanging fruit items. For the most part, they do one of three things. It would eliminate variances that Planning Commission routinely sees and, trying to reduce the frequency. It would improve our external permitting process, and it's clearer, more concise language. So these were reviewed by legal. They were also reviewed by Planning Commission and recommended for approval. The first change actually isn't zoning code. It's to Chapter 900, which is streets. The friends over in Parks and Rec asked to make some modifications to our tree preservation code. What they asked for was a definition of hazardous tree, and then to allow removal of the hazardous tree without a permit. I think one of the unintended consequences of writing and creating that tree preservation code was that there is a permitting process. Even if you want to remove one tree for a commercial piece of property, you would have to do a tree survey by a licensed, like landscape architect. That's a costly and time-consuming process. When we're dealing with, life safety issues, like a hazardous tree that might fall, onto a walking path or a sidewalk, timing is of the essence. So rather than requiring a permit, it would allow for those folks to remove it when it's deemed a hazard by a qualified person from the a director or designee of Parks and Rec. And that would be a documented inspection, so it's just not a phone call. It's going out there and determining that it is a hazard. And again, with these code changes, just like the last presentation, by all means, if you have any questions, please let me know. The vast majority of what's coming up are all zoning code items. And again, these are items that we'd want to change regardless of the zoning code rewrite that's ongoing. The first one is the subdivision without plat portion of the code. This is a process that Planning Commission sees sometimes. Some scenarios where people are subdividing a piece of property, so think of going from one large lot to two smaller lots. That can be an administrative process, or it can be a hearing before Planning Commission. It depends on the size of the property. Planning Commission has asked for that to be administrative because they don't have any criteria to evaluate it. It's kind of a lengthy process, and they don't really have any role in that. So the code has been is proposed to be changed where if the lot split meets all zoning code requirements, then that's administratively approvable. If it doesn't meet a zoning code requirement, there would be a variance, and the variance would go before Planning Commission. The next change is to 1123, which is definitions, and that's to add a definition of planning and zoning administrator. And as we just talked about, it's a higher level mayor designee, and so again, as roles and responsibilities evolve, the code doesn't need to evolve each time. One-time fix, and it's good. The next several code changes, these are to yard requirements of our single-family zoning classifications. A couple of changes here. One of those is just to kind of clean it up and make it a little bit more concise as to, determine what your setbacks and height are. We get a lot of phone calls. The way it's written now, it's a little bit verbose, it's a little bit confusing. folks have a hard time understanding what the setbacks are. So we're just formatting that to be a little bit more simple in nature, and that's actually how most of our commercial zonings are written. So it's really following a format that's already in the code. The other change is to reduce the side and rear yard for unattached accessory structures. And 95% of unattached accessory structures are sheds. So where sheds can be located. Since we amended the fence code a few years ago, our most common variance now in front of Planning Commission, at least for residential properties, are location of shed. So typically, the zoning code would say something in the neighborhood of 10-foot setback for your side yard, 10-foot setback for your rear yard. What that ends up doing is a lot of folks who come in and get a permit, places a shed pretty much in the middle of their property, and it's like, the kids can't play ball, we can't put a pool in, can we get some relief? And let's say over the last 2 years, we've probably had about 30 of those variances, and probably all but maybe 1 or 2 of those were approved. The ones that weren't approved were ones that were like right on the property line. So Planning Commission felt comfortable with reducing the side and the rear setback down to 5 feet for the majority of those single-family zoned properties. Next set of changes is to our Office Commerce Technology. That's that OCT zoning classification. Again, that's sort of south of Taylor Road. Again, the predominant use is industrial in nature. One of the changes in pretty much every site, if you were to drive Taylor Station and go down Cross Point and Blatt and Eastgate, you're going to see pretty much every single use out there has some component of outside storage. Right now, that's a conditional use in industrial. Oddly enough, it's not a conditional use in some commercial zonings, which is kind of peculiar to me, but we're proposing to make that a permitted use, meaning it's administratively approvable. It doesn't require action by Planning Commission. The good news is that every single one of those conditional uses that I've ever witnessed before Planning Commission has been approved. So again, you don't typically take things for approval when they're always approved. The good news is that the code has language on placement of outdoor storage. For example, it can't be located in the front of the site. It has to be behind a building, if there's a building on site. There's also screening standards associated with that. You have to screen it. You have to have some level of vegetation and fencing associated with that. So if you meet the code, that would be an allowed use rather than a conditional use. Then also our OCT zoning is the only zoning that has limits on storage tanks. Now that is the area where we primarily see storage tanks, but it's not the only area. And currently the code says 400 gallons or if it's over 10 feet in height. And one of our subject matter experts on Planning Commission said that like a septic tank is usually 500 gallons. So that's a very small small amount of a size of a tank that would be require Planning Commission approval. So instead of 10 feet or 400 gallons, that was requested to be changed to 2,000 gallons or 20 feet in height, meaning that if it was 2,000 gallons and less than 20 feet, that would be administratively approvable. We'd see it on a building permit. Zoning staff would review that to make sure it meets zoning code. If it was 21 feet in height, then it would have to go before Planning Commission. Parking regulations. This is the most frequent commercial variance I think Planning Commission sees. And so, all right, so for an example of our code says that when you have head-on parking, 2 rows of head-on parking, you have to have a 10-foot wide landscape island. So in our parking lot, City Hall parking lot, when I pull in and I park across, from someone, the code says that there should not be 2 headlights looking at each other, that there should actually be a 10-foot wide landscape island with shrubs. And pretty much wherever you go in the city, if I look to the south of us at Hunter's Ridge, or I look to the north of us, or where we're at, very few parking lots anywhere within the city have that landscape requirement. Pretty much almost 100% of folks ask for a variance, and that variance has always been granted. In fact, Planning Commission favors that variance because there are a few sites where that landscaping is in place and it actually impedes pedestrian traffic, and people have trampled those bushes and that, and so it's created some issues. But folks don't like looking at big giant parking lots. They tend to be unattractive. And so what staff proposed was carrying forward parking lot screening that we find in two of our zoning classifications, Old Gahanna mixed use and OCT, has requirements that the perimeter of the parking area be buffered with like a 3-foot tall evergreen vegetation or a 3-foot tall, fence or something of that nature. And so we would propose to carry that forward into all of our zoning classifications. So all the parking lots, regardless of the zoning, would have the same type of screening requirement. Let's see, where am I at? Oh, temporary signs. All right. So an interesting one for temporary signs is the first change is to remove the word consecutive from the useful life of our temporary signs. So temporary signs, to determine how long you can have a temporary sign up, it depends on the material type. And what the code says is that, let's say you have a plastic sign and it can be up there for 30 consecutive days. So that means if you want it up for 29 days and take it down for 1, you can put it right back up and have it up for 29 days, take it down. So that's a loophole. We're trying to close that loophole. Another change is to clarify where the sign can be located. Right now it says pavement. That's probably kind of a typo. All our permanent signs and most of our signage, it's all from the right of way, because 10 feet from the pavement, in a lot of cases, is going to put it in the right of way. Folks aren't going to like that. Other folks, because they don't allow things. It's a safety issue. We don't allow for signs within the right of way. So that's a clarification there. Also clarifying that cardboard paper signs are only allowed in residential districts. These typically are like garage sale signs. But right now, they're allowed in our commercial areas. We don't see a lot of those, but we do see them from occasion. That's just probably not the look that we as a community really want is paper signs out there on our major roadways. And the final change to temporary signs is to increase the duration for plastic signs from 30 days in a 6-month period to 30 days in a 4-month period. Our plastic signs typically are like special event signage, like for a play at a school or a holiday event at a church. It's also political signs as well. And the next code change, this is permanent signs. This one's maybe a little bit
So the 6 month takes it out of range.
more challenging to explain to you all, since you don't ever see signage. So the way signage works is that when you have a building and it's a single-use tenant, so if I'm opening up my shoelace shop and I'm the only one in there, the code's very clear how much signage you can have. It's like 150 total square feet, regardless if your property's a half acre or 500 acres. It's kind of how it's written. That probably isn't the best, but it's pretty straightforward and easy. But if I open up my shop in a multi-tenant building, and so there's a doctor next to me and a vape shop or whatever it may be, the code says for those multi-tenant buildings, we actually don't have any standards, and you have to do something called a master sign plan, which a master sign plan are the rules that pertain to that shopping center, that multi-tenant building only. And that is the responsibility of the landlord or the property owner. What we found out is that a lot of landlords and property owners don't want to go through a permitting process for a sign. Even when their tenant is, hey, look, I can't get a sign permit, some landlords have just said, we're not going to bother with it. So that really puts the tenants in a tough spot, because obviously tenants want to have signage. Let them know that, hey, we're new here. This is, here's our business. So what staff tried to do, because the city gets in the middle of it because of the permitting, is to allow for some types of signage, specifically wall signs and window signs, which are the primary types of signs that individual tenants have, to allow for those to be administratively approvable in certain instances. So again, I know you all don't see master sign plans, and we have less than 20. I don't know how many hundreds of multi-tenant buildings we have, but we only have like less than 20 of these master sign plans. And most of them say that the amount of signage allowed is based off of your tenant frontage. So if your tenant width, so if you have a 20-foot width tenant space, Typically, they say you get about 70 or 80% of that. So in that case, 20 feet would be 16 feet if we use the 80% width, and then there's a height limitation on that. Your height of your letters typically is in the 30s, 30, 32, 36 inches, something of that nature. So staff, we proposed to allow less than what most of the master sign plans allow, but allow something. Otherwise, it's a challenging permitting path for tenants. And so we put out 50% of the tenant width and 30 inches in height. So in the case of a 20-foot, wide tenant, I think that math comes out to, like, their sign would be about 25 square feet is what that 20-foot wide tenant frontage would allow for, which is fairly generous compared to a lot of suburban codes, but it's less permissive than what the majority of master sign plans allow. One more zoning code change. This one's a little bit simpler. This is to our conditional use expiration. So a conditional use is typically granted at the very beginning of a project's life, because if they are approved for the conditional use, then they typically get into the more detailed applications like engineering plans and building permits. The way the code is written now, you have basically a year from when that conditional use is approved to issuing of a zoning certificate, which really happens at the tail end of a building permit. And what we found is that, especially in the COVID environment with supply chain issues and things like that, that oftentimes it takes more than a year from when you get that initial high-level conditional use approval to when your building's actually constructed and that. So it's to extend that out from 1 year to 2 years. Then the final code change is a little bit more in-depth. This is not zoning code, this is building code, so we'd be coming for you with this change regardless of what's going on with the zoning code rewrite. I have my ace in the hole back here, our chief building official, Ken Foltz. He is the subject matter expert, and he can speak in more detail if necessary on this particular change. But what we're proposing to do is eliminate Chapter 1311, which is contractor registration. So what is contractor registration? When you're going through the building, it relates to the building permit process. It's a yearly process. Your registration expires December 31st of every year. So regardless if you got it January 1st or December 1st, it expires every year. So it's a yearly process. So who has to register? Well, general contractor has to register. There's a whole bunch of different types. Your HVAC folks, your plumbing, your electrical folks, they all have to register. Homeowners don't have to register as a contractor if they're performing the work themselves. So not everyone has to, but a lot of folks do. And it's the business that registers, not the individual folks working for that business. And then if you have a business, well, if you do HVAC work and you do electrical work, then you need to register as an electrical contractor and an HVAC contractor and probably a general contractor and things like that. So there's a lot of different registrations that are required. From when I had my initial discussion with building staff about some of the challenges associated with this, it really increased awareness for myself and where I'm located. I'm within earshot of our building department's front desk. And it is every day, it feels like all day, with folks bombarding building division with questions about the contractor registration process. Where is it at? Why don't I have it? Things of that nature. It's very confusing because there's different elements that they have to provide with their registration. They have to provide insurance. They have to provide their state licensing, and all those have different expiration dates and that. So sometimes their state license expires June 30th. Then they try to pull a permit July 30th, even though they're registered with the city. They no longer have their state license, so that's additional information we need to capture. The short of it is, it really does, in staff's opinion, it does affect the permitting process. It negatively affects the permitting process quite a bit. I think some of the important things to know is that the registration process, we've talked about it at length. We're not 100% certain what the goal was of the registration process. because it doesn't protect the city. The city's not involved. You're a homeowner and you're using a contractor. The city doesn't have really a dog in that fight. So whether it's registered with the city or not doesn't really matter. Doesn't affect the outcome if there's an issue between the landowner and who's doing the work. That's a civil matter. It's not a city matter. So again, it's really not something the city would normally be involved in, and Ken's been with the city in one capacity or another since, 92? 88. And, this has never come into play. And another thing to note is that the state now has a licensing requirement. It wasn't in effect when our code was in effect that had this process. And the state's licensing is actually a test of skill. So there is a skill component to that, where ours is more of a paperwork kind of function. So for those various reasons, that's why we would like to eliminate that requirement. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you all have.
Thank you, Director, very much for that. Just on that last point, where, do you know what the state's website is where residents can look up the licenses? I know I sprung that on you, so.
I know I've seen it somewhere, but not sure where. It's not something that we really,
We could look it up and provide it.
Yeah.
The state's licensing is regulated by the OCILB, Iowa Contractor Industry Licensing.
why don't you step up to the mic?
Yeah, the contractor licensing by the state is all handled by the OCILB. And it's licensing for HVAC, electrical, plumbing, gas piping, and then for the Ohio Fire Marshal, they register and license fire alarm and sprinkler designers and installers. We can still require that without having registration. We're not allowed to license. Technically, all we can do is register contractors. The state requires licensing.
Thank you. That was, well, thank you, Mr. Phillips. Mr. Schnetzer.
Thank you, Mr. Blackford, once again. I want to go back to the portion about the sheds, because I know I've encountered that from residents asking about what's permitted and stuff like that. There are, as I was thumbing through the attachment, there are apparently several sections that reference that, and there's a lot of stuff about front setbacks, side setbacks, attached accessory structures, unattached accessory structures. Is it safe to say you could boil all of that down to say that we're just simply talking about sheds, and the only change is that it goes from, what, 10 feet to 5 feet?
Essentially, I mean, unattached accessory structures in Gahanna typically, and like I said, I'm going to say 90%, but that's I wouldn't sign my life away that that's what it is. But it also could be like a pergola or something like that. There's not a whole bunch of things that would qualify as an unattached accessory structure. But yeah, that's essentially what we're doing. We're not allowing it in the front yard. And it's not allowed in the current code. It's not allowed in this code either. But yes, it's to reduce that setback.
So irrespective of all the references to front setbacks, et cetera, really all we're talking about is where you can put a shed, pergola, et cetera. And
For the
we're-
most part, yes. The other changes you see redline is really just to simplify what those standards are, because we get a lot of phone calls from folks. There's a lot of permitting associated with residential properties because of, improvements and things like seasonal improvements and that. And folks just have a really hard time understanding the language, but it's not changing.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure with all those red lines that we.
Yes, sir, yes, it is confusing, yes.
We're not
You haven't.
oversimplifying it here, but anyway, okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Renner.
Thank you. I want to dovetail a little bit with what Mr. Schnetzer was asking. It's more of a curiosity, but I was wanting to know, how do you deal with deed restrictions?
That's an easy one. We don't have to.
You don't have
Municipalities,
to?
nope. Nope, that's a civil matter.
That's a civil matter. So if,
Comes up in planning commission, I'll look to Matt, but
okay. So if somebody wanted to press the case, they would actually have to go down to the courts.
that's correct. So, so a real-world example of that, and I don't deal with this type of permitting usually, but from what my understanding is that maybe we don't have a lot of homeowner associations in Gahanna, but we do have some. I think Harrison Pond has some about maybe some regulations on, fencing and sheds. And I know I've heard of as far as like signage and that. So maybe our code would say, hey, you can have some residential, single-family signage, but if the deed restriction says no, well, that's up to the homeowner. That's not up to the city. We would still issue that permit because it would meet our code.
Right, okay. And then I was drawing a blank. Can you give me an example of what a subdivision without a plat would be?
Yeah, so essentially what that typically is I have one lot and I want to make it two lots. And what we're saying is when you go from one lot to two lot, as long as that meets zoning regulations for lot size,
Right.
and that's really what we're looking at because you're not approving a building layout or anything of that nature. It's just, creating a new parcel. And so that's, as long as you're meeting zoning code, there's really no legal way of denying something like that. And so planning commission, it's like it comes before us, but we really don't have a role in that. So we really don't want to see these anymore. And in most places, most jurisdictions, that's a, administrative process.
Very good, thank you.
Ms. Bowers?
Yeah, a couple items. Thank you, Director, for presenting tonight on both where we are with zoning reform and these proposed changes. Just a quick item, the utilities and lighting, section 1155.08. I just noticed in B, looking at the red line, that maybe there was some missed redlining in there, so just go back and take a look at that again. It didn't look like 10 was stricken, but 20 was added. So I was just noticing that. The other thing I wanted to just bring up is kind of a discussion. I appreciate that you've considered removing the permit requirement for hazardous trees that are determined by the forester or the Parks and Rec Department. One of the questions that I had that's kind of come up through sidewalk issues was that if a tree is determined to be a contributor to sidewalk upheaval, and it's not part of the sidewalk program, it's not in an area that's part of the sidewalk program, then in order to fix the sidewalk after receiving a citation, that the homeowner then still has to get a permit to remove that tree. Has there been any discussion about potentially removing the requirement for that permit because it's being removed as part of sidewalk repair?
I'm not involved in that permitting process, and the planning office isn't. So I don't know if I'm 100% qualified, but I would say that I imagine that probably is a permit because it's in the right-of-way. Street trees are typically in the right-of-way, so I think that's a right-of-way permit that's necessary. Typically, with zoning and tree removal on single-family zone lots, that's exempt. We don't get involved in that. So I think it's only because it's in the right-of-way that's triggering a different permitting process.
I would say
think.
you're exactly right. And there has been no discussion around changing that process because of the work that is done in the right-of-way with utilities, et cetera, making sure that any work done in that area is tracked is critical.
Is it one permit for that right-of-way work? So in order to remove the tree and repair the sidewalk, would that be considered a
Yes.
streamlined single
My
permit?
recollection and understanding is it's one permit, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you. And then I guess just the last question I had around the signage. I know that I've had some concerns around signage that's being placed at intersections, temporary signage that's being placed in intersections. It's not associated with a homeowner or with any kind of property owner's permission. Sure. But beyond that, are there concerns and complaints about individual homeowners having signs in their yards?
I'm aware of a few.
Around, I mean, that's giving rise to the proposed changes
No,
here?
no, not to the rise of the proposed changes. So, there's been a few instances of the past of some code enforcement complaints related to signs, and almost everything is a sign. I had a little bit of a brief conversation. There are a few things that are exempt, like, signs in the right-of-way for, roadway and that. And then there's some basic things like hour of operation and, warnings. But like if you have a sign up that says, candidate X, because it's a presidential election year, that technically is a sign, and that should require well, we don't require permits for temporary signage in residential districts,
Yeah.
but there are guidelines to that. But that's not really why these changes were being made.
Just one of the concerns that I have, and with early voting starting in October, election day not until November, it's been very typical, whether it's local cycles, presidential cycles, for folks to have political signs in their yards preceding the start of early vote. And this would potentially cause lots of citations to homeowners. And so I guess I'm just not sure what our enforcement is going to look like.
I
And
don't think this changes the citation process at all.
it would potentially increase, I'm saying it would increase exposure to residents who might have signs up preceding the start of early voting through Election Day.
I'm not sure how this code change would do that.
I'm thinking we'd have more violators.
The typical type of election signs are plastic signs, and the duration is going from 30 days and 6 months to 30 days and 4 months.
No, consecutive is the problem though, right? So if in the past it's been consecutive days. And now you're removing consecutive, so it could be any 30 days in any
Okay,
4-month period. And you
Yeah.
said you were removing that to close that loophole.
Sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
my concern is just that we're going to be creating problems for our residents.
Well, that's a valid point. I don't see it as being so much a problem. There's, what is the vision of the community? Because without closing that loophole, every 30 days, so 29 days, you're talking about 15 days or so a year where there wouldn't be a sign up. So you could have an extremely long period of time. If we don't add the language about consecutive days, 30 consecutive days, then it's, if we leave it in there, you can have it up for 29 days, take it down for 1, put it up for 29 days, take it down for 1. So it's this perpetual cycle of having signage up.
So would there be a reception then to changing it to 60 days in any 4-month period? That way you've covered now the full voting period from early vote to election day.
Well, it's whatever you all want. So that's a community preference. I would just say, though, it's the one thing with signage is unless it's off-premise signage, we cannot restrict content at all. So
Right.
this doesn't just apply to political signs. It would be any type of plastic sign.
Sure,
Mr. Roth.
thank you.
I might be able to settle this. There was a federal court decision, I think, out of Cleveland, 10 years, maybe more ago, that said you can't put time limits on political speech. So political yard signs are allowed year-round, basically.
Yeah.
Most municipalities have codes that say 30 days before an election, 45 days before an election, but they're really not enforceable. We can still enforce, you can't put it in the right-of-way, that kind of thing. We can restrict the size, but the political aspect of it means it can be out there whenever.
And so our code does not have any language about when that sign can come up, because again, we don't categorize things as political signs.
Okay, but it would be unenforceable for political signs anyways, so that takes care of my question. Thank you.
Well, hold on, because what would be unenforceable?
What Mr. Roth just said.
The time limit aspect of it.
That's, when you say the time limit aspect, you're not talking about the duration, you're talking about when a political sign goes up.
No, I'm talking about you can have a political sign up 365 days a year.
That's not my understanding in all the case law that I've seen and been a part of, but that's a separate discussion,
Okay.
so.
We can look into that.
As long as it's on the property.
Yeah.
That'd be, If you don't mind looking into that and sharing among us, that'd be
They're
appreciated.
a lot more interested in that than I am. So.
Yeah.
Mrs. McGregor.
Well, I was just going to say to Marissa's point, if it was 39 days, it would be the beginning of the month before the next election. Like, that'd be the most you'd need it before a general election would be 39 days. 30 days kind of makes it awkward, but 39 days would make it.
If you want 60 days, that's fine. It's whatever number you all want. I'd be happy to make that change if there's a preference. That's a very easy change.
I mean,
Probably do it right
although
now.
I've heard what Mr. Roth has said too, is that political signs can go up any time for any length. So that's it.
I'd say we probably shouldn't have that discussion right here, right now. So, barring, let's say let's assume it's true, we don't need to do anything. But if it's not the case, then we do need to do something. So what would be that language that,
Why don't we settle the legal issue, the legal question first, and then we can bring this back to committee? Or we can bifurcate that aspect of, from the ordinance and advance the rest.
what would that be?
The rest of the code changes that are in here?
Yes, I'm sorry. What would be the change that you wanted to bifurcate?
The signage, the temporary signage section.
Take the temporary signage change out and leave
That
everything else
applies to
in.
all temporary signs and all zonings and all types.
I think until we have some clarity, I think that would be appropriate.
All right, I mean, again, that's up to you all.
Well, and I think too, from a timing perspective, the charter, based on the charter, earliest we could have a first reading on this is May 15th with a second on June 5th with the public hearing. Is that correct, Mr. Clerk?
Yes, charter does require 30 days public notice, so if you were to schedule a vote, let's say a second reading, the earliest that could happen is June 5th in order to meet the public hearing requirement.
So I have a feeling we'll be back at committee anyway, if there's any additional questions on this, and perhaps in a response from the city attorney's office on that question. But I did have, are we good on that item at the moment? Or that?
Yes, that covered the three items I had, yes.
I did have one, for 116308 G, just maybe me being nitpicky, the reason for going to should, because that's, I kind of like the idea of something cut and dry. Is it, you have to do it or you don't?
What section was that again?
116308 interior landscaping requirements, G. I mean, I think
Sorry, you
this
said
is
B?
G,
as in book-
as in
G.
George, I'm sorry. I think this is where you were starting to get into, you see a lot of variance requests.
Oh, yeah, the minimum parking island size, yeah, that's a design feature. And so what typically happens is in that 200 square feet, you have to place a tree. But because of a lot of parking lots have odd angles and that, and so folks will put it there. As long as it's appropriately sized to have a tree, it can be less than 200 square feet. So, should kind of made sense because there are quite a few that are close, but not quite. And that's not a hard, fast standard. 200 square feet is necessary for, a parking lot tree to survive. That's a good number, but it's not an end-all, be-all number. And that, so if it's less than 200, then those areas wouldn't count towards that space right now, parking lot.
So are you saying that under a shall standard, you would have to have a variance request then?
Not exactly, but you're correct. Typically, it would be in this case that 199 square foot tree island couldn't be used to satisfy the 5% of the landscape requirement of the parking area. So it would be there, but it wouldn't meet. It couldn't be used towards that requirement.
Okay. All right. I think Mrs. McGregor, you had additional item.
Did you say, when you were talking about the size of tanks, what kind of tanks? Did you say septic tanks?
Well, that was the example that one of our planning commission members used, but we've only seen a handful of these. And, you know, I think like Grody's got one. I don't know if it's propane or what, you know, large. Typically, they're a large white kind of tank out there where they have some type of.
But septic tank wouldn't be above ground, would it?
No, it wouldn't be. It was an odd. It was used not to say that this necessarily would apply to septic tanks, but just it was used by a planning commission member to illustrate how small 400 gallons is.
Okay.
When your residential septic tank is typically 500 gallons, and I'm not an expert in that, you know, he was talking about that, you know, where, you know, when you're on an industrial site, 400 gallons is very small. And if it's residential, it's 500 gallons, it should be much larger than 400 gallons for a commercial site.
I've seen, as far as sheds, I've seen, not a lot, but some variances to have them at the side of the house. And will that still be a variance required by?
No. So the language was clarified a little bit, and this was part of the good discussion that had with legal on some issues that they've dealt with. And so it was clarified that it can be located to the side of the home, but it can't be in the front yard. So the language was tweaked a little bit as a result of a real-world kind of case that we had. So it can be in the side yard, can't be in the front of the house. It has to be to the side or to the rear of the house, and it can be within that side yard setback up to 5 feet, the rear yard setback up to 5 feet. But
It just seems that it should be in the backyard unless there's a real good reason for it to be in the side yard. And sometimes there are because of the lay of the land, and I've seen those variances coming before planning because the land is not level or there's a swale
that's
at
what
the
a
back.
variance is supposed to be. Yeah, there's
But
usually it's like a topographical.
in general, I don't think it should be allowed in the side yard as a rule. It should be the exception because of a specific,
And that's
problem with the
again,
lot.
that's a community preference. This was generated because of all the variances, and those variances to the side yard setback being routinely approved.
I mean, just because somebody says, well, it's not convenient for me to go to the back of the yard, it's just like, that's where we have them, and, it affects the neighbors' houses, because it's right beside, maybe right outside their window. And so, that's my preference, that it be the exception rather than the rule to be allowed them in the side yard.
Again,
that's my opinion.
this wasn't my brainchild. This was planning
I
commission.
know,
So
that's would be
again,
mine.
it's whatever city council wants. You guys have the authority.
I think the only thing is about the registration for the contractors. I know that you do require your insurance declarations. Is there any value in that, in the city having to know that, as far as just from the benefit that the homeowner knows that they have insurance with certain declarations? Is that not? Would they, I guess they could still check that on their own, couldn't they?
They could in that, but I mean, I don't know, Ken, has that ever come up? Has anyone ever? I mean, that sounds very logical and all that, but I don't think that that's something that, in reality, we get any phone calls or inquiries about. But yeah, it sounds logical. Yeah, absolutely.
And I just want to thank the mayor for sending over the license lookup, which can be done at elicense4.com.ohio.gov. For the record, say that, and just scroll down and click on look up a license. So thanks for sending that over. Anything else on this item before we let Mr. Blackford sit down?
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Director.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Next up, items from the Department of Finance. Good evening, Director Burry.
Good evening. How's everybody doing tonight?
Well, thank you.
I just have 2 items for you tonight. First item is a request for an ordinance for supplemental appropriations. This is related to the first real estate tax settlement. When it came in, there were some fees that were unanticipated related to delinquent tax collections. So asking for $53,000 more in the TIF funds, $400 more in the bond retirement fund, and $410 in the pension fund to various accounts to make sure that we're set for the second half settlement.
Any questions? First and then consent?
Sure.
All right. Next item, please.
Next item is a request for a resolution for a then and now purchase. So there was a 137th class went through the Columbus Police Academy in 2021. During that time, both departments were dealing with a lot with COVID protocol and staffing shortages. So in short, their invoice came very late. And then, of course, appropriations were not set at that time as far as encumbrances. Appropriations were available, though. So this is a request for a then and now purchase, as the funds were appropriated, were available then at the time of the purchase, and now, so requesting a resolution for a then and now purchase.
Okay, just a resolution, so consent, okay? All right. Thank you very much, Director. Next up, items from the Department of Public Service. Good evening, Director.
Good evening. I have just a couple typical ordinance for tonight. The first one is the ordinance of authorization for supplemental appropriation for damage to city property. The Department of Public Service has received funds over the last quarter from the damage of city property. These funds are currently unappropriated and unencumbered. The department respectfully requests an ordinance for supplemental appropriation.
All right. First and then consent? All right, thank you.
And the, excuse me, the second one is the Department of Public Service has received funds over the last quarter for water meter fees. These funds are currently unappropriated and unencumbered. The department respectfully requests ordinance for supplemental appropriation for those.
Anything from colleagues? All right, first and then consent on that one. All right, anything, thank you, Director. Anything else before we adjourn? All right, thank you, everybody. We're adjourned.